History remembers monsters, but it does not remember them evenly. Some names are preserved with careful detail, their actions recorded, their cruelty documented, their reputations reinforced across generations. Others are shaped more gradually, altered by rumor, repetition, and a subtle influence of those who benefit from a particular version of events being believed. Over time, the line between what was done and what was said to have been done begins to blur. Accounts conflict. Motives shift. Stories grow sharper at the edges and darker at the center. What remains is not always a clear record, but something more complex. A figure suspended between history and legend, where truth and narrative have become difficult to separate. And once that transformation begins, it rarely reverses. A person becomes a symbol. A life becomes a warning. A name becomes inseparable from the story history chooses to remember. There are places in history where the past does not feel distant, where time seems to settle rather than pass, collecting in quiet corners like dust that refuses to be disturbed. In those places, stories do not begin so much as they linger, waiting for someone to notice them again. The tale of Elizabeth Báthory exists in that kind of space. It does not arrive cleanly, nor does it present itself with certainty. Instead, it emerges in fragments, whispers carried through centuries, shaped and reshaped by those who repeated them until the woman at its center became something far larger than a life. She is remembered by a name that sounds less like a title and more like a verdict: the Blood Countess. The image is immediate and unsettling. A noblewoman surrounded by darkness, her power absolute within the stone walls of her estates, her cruelty said to be limitless. Stories describe rooms hidden from the world, where suffering was not only inflicted, but ritualized. They speak of young women disappearing into her service and never returning, of punishment so elaborate they blur the line between discipline and something far more deliberate. And most famously, they tell of blood, of a belief, whispered as fact, that youth could be preserved if one was willing to take it from another. It is a story that feels almost too complete, too perfectly aligned with the way we imagine monsters to behave. And that is precisely where the unease begins. Because Elizabeth Báthory was not a shadowy figure living outside the structure of society. She was born into one of the most powerful noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary in the late 16th century, a world defined by rigid hierarchies, political tension, and constant warfare. Her lineage connected her to kings, to military leaders, to some of the most influential figures in Central Europe. She was educated, multilingual, and entrusted with the management of vast estates during a time when such responsibility was rarely placed in the hands of women. By every measurable standard of her time, she was not an outsider. She was the structure. And yet, history does not remember her for her influence, her intelligence, or her position. It remembers her for what she is said to have done. According to the most extreme accounts, Elizabeth Báthory was responsible for the torture and murder of hundreds of young women, with some testimonies claiming a number as high as 650 victims. The accusations are staggering, not only in scale but in their specificity. Witnesses described instruments designed for suffering, methods intended to prolong it, and a level of cruelty that seemed to exceed even the harsh realities of the era in which she lived. These accounts would later solidify into a narrative that has endured for centuries, placing her among the most infamous figures in European history. But numbers, especially in stories like these, have a way of becoming something else over time. They stop functioning as measurements and begin acting as symbols. 650 is not just a count, it is a declaration. It transforms a person into something beyond comprehension, into a figure that can no longer be understood through ordinary human terms. And once that transformation occurs, the story becomes far more difficult to question. This is where the edges of the narrative begin to blur, because the same history that preserves these accusations also reveals a different kind of landscape beneath them, one shaped by power struggles, political ambition, and the fragile nature of reputation in a world where influence could be as dangerous as it was valuable. Elizabeth Báthory was a widow controlling immense wealth at a time when such autonomy was rare. Her estates were strategically significant, her connections extensive, and her authority largely independent. In a society where alliances shifted quickly and loyalties were often transactional, that kind of position could make a person both powerful and vulnerable. It raises a question that lingers beneath every retelling of her story. Was she truly what history claims she was? Or did history need her to become it? The idea that history creates monsters is not new, but it is often uncomfortable to confront. It suggests that the stories we inherit are not always records of truth, but constructions shaped by those who had the ability and the motivation to define them. In the case of Elizabeth Báthory, the timing of her downfall, the nature of the accusations, and the individuals involved in bringing those accusations forward all exist within a context that invites scrutiny. Her arrest in 1610 did not come from a spontaneous revelation of hidden crimes. It followed years of rumors, investigations led by powerful figures, and testimonies collected under conditions that would not meet modern standards of reliability. Many of the witnesses were servants or individuals of lower social standing, people whose voices were mediated through the authority of those conducting the inquiries. Some accounts were secondhand. Others were extracted under pressure. Few, if any, were tested in a way that would allow for certainty. And perhaps most notably, Elizabeth Báthory herself was never given a public trial. Instead, she was confined to her castle, effectively removed from the world without the formal process that would have allowed her to defend herself against the accusations. The decision was presented as a resolution, a necessary response to unspeakable crimes. But it also ensured that her voice would not become part of the official record. What remains instead are the voices of others, those who accused, those who documented, and those who interpreted. From that point forward, the story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to history. Over time, that history would grow. Details would be added, interpretations expanded, and the narrative would take on a life of its own. The image of the Blood Countess would become more vivid, more symbolic, until it reached a point where separating fact from embellishment became nearly impossible. She would be compared to vampires, associated with legends that had not yet fully formed during her lifetime, and positioned as a precursor to myths that would later define entire genres of horror. She became a story that refused to remain contained. But stories like this do not persist simply because they are told. They endure because they resonate, because they tap into fears that extend far beyond the specifics of one historical life. The tale of the Blood Countess speaks to anxieties about power without accountability, cruelty hidden behind respectability, and the unsettling possibility that monstrosity does not always exist at society's edges. Sometimes it exists comfortably at its very center. That persistence is worth paying attention to. History is filled with murderers, tyrants, and forgotten nobles whose names have long since faded from memory. Elizabeth Báthory did not fade. Her story crossed borders, survived political upheaval, inspired novels, films, and folklore, and became woven into the larger mythology of European horror. Whether that endurance is the result of extraordinary crimes or an extraordinary powerful story is, perhaps, the most important question we can ask before we begin. It also reflects something quieter but equally significant. the possibility that we do not always know where the truth ends and the story begins. Once enough time has passed, stories rarely preserve events exactly as they happened. They preserve the meaning later generations found within them, and in doing so, they often blur the line between historical memory and cultural mythology. As we step into this narrative, it is important to understand that what follows is not a simple account of events. It is an exploration of how those events were recorded, interpreted, and ultimately remembered. It is a story built from documents, testimonies, and centuries of retelling, each layer adding its own influence to the shape of what we now recognize as the legend of Elizabeth Báthory. Some elements of what follows may be grounded firmly in reality. Others may exist because they were useful, compelling, or simply too powerful for later generations to abandon. Somewhere between those possibilities stands a real person, a woman who lived, governed vast estates, exercised genuine authority, and ultimately became the center of one of history's most enduring and disturbing narratives. Recovering that person from beneath centuries of interpretation may not be entirely possible, but it is worth trying before we allow the legend to speak in her place. Whether she was the architect of unimaginable cruelty or the subject of one of the most elaborate reputational constructions ever recorded is a question that has never been fully resolved. But the fact that it remains unresolved may be the most important detail of all, because it suggests that the story of the Blood Countess is far more than whatever happened inside the walls of Čachtice Castle. It is about the strange power history possesses to elevate one life above thousands of others, smoothing away uncertainty until a complicated person becomes a simple symbol. Whether Elizabeth Báthory was one of history's greatest killers or one of its greatest cautionary tales about reputation remains an open question. But once a story reaches the point where it no longer needs certainty to survive, it has become something far more enduring than history. It has become legend. Before Elizabeth Báthory became a name spoken with unease, before the accusations, the testimonies, and the transformation into something almost mythic, she existed within a world that was already defined by violence. Not the kind that would later be attributed to her, but a more familiar, more acceptable form. War, discipline, hierarchy. The late 16th century in Central Europe was not a quiet place. It was a region shaped by conflict, where borders shifted under pressure and survival often depended on strength, loyalty, and the ability to exert control over others. To understand Elizabeth Báthory, it is necessary to begin not with the allegations, but with the structure that produced her. She was born in 1560 into the Báthory family, one of the most influential noble houses in the Kingdom of Hungary. Power, in this context, was not abstract. It was inherited, reinforced, and expected to be maintained. Her relatives include princes, voivodes, and military leaders who played direct roles in shaping the political landscape in Eastern Europe. This was a lineage that did not simply participate in history, it helped direct it. From an early age, Elizabeth would have been immersed in this environment, where authority was both a privilege and a responsibility. Education among the nobility was not universal, but in her case, it was extensive. She is believed to have been literate in multiple languages, including Hungarian, Latin, and German, a reflection of both her status and the expectations placed upon her. This level of education was uncommon for women of the time, but the Báthory family did not operate within ordinary limitations. Their influence required a certain level of capability, regardless of gender. The world Elizabeth grew up in was structured around control. Serfdom was the foundation of social order, with peasants bound to the land and subject to the authority of the nobility. Discipline was not only accepted, but expected, and punishment was often severe. What might be considered excessive or even monstrous by modern standards was, in many cases, normalized within this system. Violence, when exercised by those in power, was rarely questioned. It was seen as necessary. a tool for maintaining order in a world that offered few alternatives. Public punishment was part of the architecture of authority. Executions took place before crowds. Whippings were administered where others could witness them. The suffering of one person became a lesson for everyone else. In a society built on rigid hierarchy, mercy was often viewed as weakness, while fear was considered an effective form of governance. This context does not excuse what Elizabeth Báthory would later be accused of becoming, but it does complicate how those accusations should be understood. The line between accepted violence and extraordinary cruelty was not as clearly defined in the early 17th century as it appears from the perspective of the modern world. Practices that would horrify us today often existed comfortably within the legal and social expectations of the time. That reality does not diminish genuine brutality, but it does make it far more difficult to determine whether ordinary authority ended and exceptional cruelty truly began. At the age of around 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a nobleman and military commander known for his campaign against the Ottoman Empire. The marriage was not unusual for the time. It was strategic, designed to strengthen alliances between powerful families, but it also placed Elizabeth in a position that would shape the rest of her life in ways that are often overlooked in simplified retellings of her story. Ferenc Nadasdy was frequently absent, engaged in military campaigns that required his attention far from the estates. During these absences, the responsibility for managing their holdings fell to Elizabeth. This was not a ceremonial role. It involved overseeing finances, maintaining order among servants, and ensuring the continued productivity of lands that supported not only her household, but the broader network of obligations tied to their status. In effect, she governed. For the people living on her estates, that authority was not abstract. Elizabeth Báthory could influence marriages, settle disputes, oversee punishments, collect rents, and determine the daily conditions under which hundreds of families lived. There was little practical distinction between her decisions and the law itself. To those beneath her station, appealing beyond her authority was often impossible. That imbalance of power would become one of the most important pieces of the story, because it helps explain how extraordinary cruelty, if it existed, might have remained hidden for so long, and how extraordinary accusations, if they were false, would have been just as difficult to challenge. This is a detail that carries weight, because it reframes the way Elizabeth Báthory is often imagined. She was not isolated, nor was she removed from the mechanisms of power. She was deeply embedded within them, actively participating in the administration of a system that relied on hierarchy and control. Her authority was not symbolic. It was exercised daily, in decisions that affected the lives of those who lived and worked on her estates. And for many years, there's no clear indication that this authority was considered unusual or problematic. Records from this period are limited, but what exists suggests the woman fulfilling the role expected of her. Correspondence indicates involvement in legal matters, property disputes, and the management of resources. There are no immediate signs of the kind of behavior that would later define her reputation. If anything, she appears as a figure consistent with her position, capable, authoritative, and integrated into the structure of noble life. Which makes what follows more difficult to reconcile. The transition from respected noblewoman to one of history's most infamous figures is not clearly documented. There is no single moment where the narrative shifts, no definitive point at which the historical record suddenly begins describing the crimes that would later define her reputation. Instead, the transformation appears gradual, almost imperceptible, as though something beneath the surface had been building long before anyone attempted to give it a name. Some accounts suggest that Elizabeth's exposure to violence began early, that she witnessed acts of brutality within her own family or environment that may have shaped her understanding of power and punishment. These stories, however, are difficult to verify. They exist primarily in later retellings, often colored by the knowledge of what she would eventually be accused of. It becomes challenging to separate genuine memory from retrospective interpretation, where details are added to create a more coherent narrative. What can be said with greater certainty is that Elizabeth Báthory learned to operate within the system exceptionally well. She navigated legal disputes, managed complex estates, corresponded with officials, and maintained the economic machinery expected of one of Hungary's most influential noble families. Nothing in the surviving records from these years suggests someone already infamous or spectacular cruelty. If such behavior existed, it either escaped notice remarkably well, or had not yet become part of the story history would later tell. And yet, even within a society where violence was normalized, there were still limits. There were actions that stood apart from accepted punishment and crossed into something even contemporaries recognized as excessive. If the accusations against Elizabeth Báthory are taken at face value, they do not describe someone simply participating in an already brutal culture. They describe someone who pushed beyond its accepted boundaries with deliberate, sustained cruelty. That is the question history ultimately asks of her. Not whether violence existed in her world, because it unquestionably did, but whether she transformed that violence into something altogether different. By the early 17th century, subtle changes begin to appear in the historical record. Reports of missing servants, rumors circulating among local communities, and a growing unease that would eventually reach the attention of higher authorities. These were not yet formal accusations. They were fragments, the kind of details that often precede larger developments, but do not, on their own, confirm anything. It is in these fragments that the story begins to shift, because they mark the transition from private life to public scrutiny, from a position of unquestioned authority to one where the authority begins to attract attention. And in this society, where power was both respected and feared, that attention could be dangerous, especially for someone for Elizabeth Báthory's position. A wealthy widow, controlling significant land and resources, operating with a degree of independence that was uncommon and, to some, potentially threatening. Her husband's death in 1604 left her without the protective presence of a military figure whose reputation alone may have discouraged inquiry. Without him, the balance of power around her began to change, and the environment that had once supported her authority may have started to view it differently. It is within this shifting political and social landscape that the first real questions begin to take shape. They are not yet questions about proven crimes, but about persistent rumors emerging from within her estates. Stories carried by servants, repeated among neighboring communities, and gradually noticed by individuals whose voices had long been ignored unless they happened to align with the interests of those in power. As those accounts accumulated, they ceased to exist as isolated conversations and slowly became something much more influential. A narrative capable of redefining Elizabeth Báthory long before any formal judgment had been reached. One that would grow, evolve, and eventually redefine Elizabeth Báthory in a way that no amount of status or lineage could prevent. For now, nothing has been proven. There are only scattered rumors, uneasy conversations, and questions that refuse to disappear. History has not yet decided who Elizabeth Báthory is. She is still a noblewoman, still a widow, still one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. But somewhere beyond the walls of her estates, a story has begun to circulate. And stories, once they gather enough voices behind them, have a way of becoming far more difficult to stop than the people they are about. Stories like this rarely begin with certainty. They do not arrive fully formed, nor do they declare themselves as truth. Instead, they gather quietly, assembling themselves from fragments, small observations, passing comments, details that seem insignificant until they are placed beside one another. The story of Elizabeth Báthory did not begin with a single accusation. It began with absence. Young women entered her service and did not return. At first, this was not unusual. Servants moved between households frequently, especially in regions where noble estates required a constant rotation of labor. A girl leaving one position for another would not have raised immediate concern, particularly if her departure was unrecorded were explained informally. In a world without centralized documentation, without systems designed to track individuals of lower status, disappearance could exist without being noticed, at least for a time. But absence, when repeated, begins to take on a different shape. A single unexplained disappearance can be dismissed as misfortune or coincidence. Repeated disappearances invite comparison, and comparison is often where suspicion begins. What first appeared to be isolated incidents slowly started resembling a pattern, one that became increasingly difficult for neighboring communities to ignore. By the early 17th century, accounts from the area surrounding Báthory's estates suggest that something was beginning to feel wrong. These were not yet formal reports. They were quieter than that, carried through conversations rather than documentation. Families began to question why daughters sent into noble service were not returning. Local communities, which relied on shared knowledge to maintain some sense of continuity, began to notice that certain names no longer circulated as they once had. One family may have accepted the explanation that their daughter had found work elsewhere. Another may have assumed illness that claimed her life before word could travel home. But as months turned into years and similar stories emerged from neighboring villages, those individual explanations became harder to believe. A missing servant could be dismissed. 5 could be coincidence. Dozens began to feel like something else entirely. This kind of awareness rarely emerges all at once. It develops gradually as individuals compare experiences, recognize familiar details, and begin to suspect that what once seemed isolated may actually be connected. Once that realization takes hold, silence becomes much harder to maintain because every new rumor begins reinforcing the ones that came before it. Still, speaking openly against a figure like Elizabeth Báthory was not a simple decision. The social structure of the time did not favor those who challenged authority, particularly when that authority belonged to one of the most powerful families in the region. Accusations carried risk. To question a noble was to position oneself against a system designed to protect them. Which is why the earliest whispers rarely took the form of direct accusations. They existed instead as suggestions, uneasy conversations, and stories told carefully enough that responsibility for them remained difficult to trace. A servant might hint at something seen but never fully explain it. A traveler could repeat rumors heard in one village only to discover similar accounts in another. A priest might notice inconsistencies in explanations surrounding deaths or disappearances connected to the estates. None of these observations proved anything on their own, but together they began suggesting that whatever was occurring inside Báthory's household extended beyond the accepted limits of noble discipline. That distinction is important because punishment during this period was often public. Authority was reinforced by allowing others to witness the consequence of disobedience. What these rumors described instead was secrecy. Victims disappeared from public view. Alleged abuse behind closed doors. If those stories were true, they represented something fundamentally different from the ordinary violence of the age, and that difference transformed rumor into suspicion. Because it marks a point where behavior begins to shift from accepted practice into something that invites suspicion. As these whispers spread, they did not remain confined to the lower levels of society. Information, even in a fragmented form, has a way of moving upward, especially when it aligns with existing tensions. By this time, Elizabeth Báthory's position had already become more complicated. Her husband's death had altered the balance around her, leaving her in control of significant wealth and influence without the immediate presence of a male counterpart to anchor that authority within the expectations of the time. This independence, while entirely legitimate, was not necessarily comfortable for those operating within a society that favored clearly defined hierarchies. Whenever an established balance of power begins to shift, uncertainty creates opportunities, and opportunities often encourage closer scrutiny from those already watching. Rumor has a particular way of climbing social hierarchies. What begins as anxious conversation among servants eventually reaches stewards. Stewards speak with neighboring estates. Clergy hear confessions and complaints. local officials begin comparing stories. By the time information reaches someone capable of acting, it has already been reshaped dozens of times, carrying with it both genuine observations and the distortions that inevitably accompany repetition. It is within this environment that György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and one of the most powerful officials in the kingdom, begins to enter the story. His role would later become central, but at this stage, his involvement is more subtle. As a representative of royal authority, Thurzó was responsible for maintaining order, particularly in cases where noble conduct might threaten the stability of the region. Whether he initially viewed the rumors surrounding Báthory as credible concerns or as political opportunities is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the whispers had reached a level where they could no longer be ignored. Whether every rumor was true almost becomes secondary at this point. Once enough people believed that something terrible might be happening, inaction carried its own political risk. If the accusations proved true, failing to investigate would reflect poorly on the very authorities responsible for maintaining order. The rumors had reached a point where someone with power would eventually be forced to respond. Investigations in this period did not resemble modern processes. They were not bound by standardized procedures or evidentiary requirements. Instead, they relied heavily on testimony, statements collected from individuals whose credibility was often assessed through social standing rather than verifiable consistency. Servants, villagers, and lower-ranking members of the household became the primary sources of information, their accounts filtered through those conducting the inquiry. As those accounts accumulated, they gradually became more detailed. What had begun as vague suggestions of unusually harsh treatment evolved into specific descriptions of brutality. Witnesses spoke of beatings that extended far beyond correction, of punishments seemingly intended to prolong suffering rather than maintain discipline. Some described confinement, starvation, or exposure to freezing temperatures. Others mentioned specialized instruments of abuse, though the exact descriptions varied depending on the source. The picture becoming visible was increasingly disturbing, even if the details were not always consistent. It is equally important to recognize the circumstances under which these testimonies were collected. They were not gathered in isolation, but within an investigation already attempting to determine whether extraordinary crimes had occurred. The presence of authority, the expectations of investigators, and the growing reputation surrounding Elizabeth Báthory all had the potential to influence how witnesses remembered events and how their statements were ultimately interpreted. Some may have described genuine experiences. Others may have repeated stories already circulating through the region. In many cases, separating first-hand observation from inherited rumor is no longer possible. What survives from these early investigations is therefore not a single unified account, but a collection of testimonies that agree in some places and diverge in others. There is enough consistency to suggest that something unusual may have been happening, yet enough variation to resist complete certainty. Even so, once an investigation begins assembling scattered accounts into a coherent narrative, every new testimony is naturally interpreted alongside those already collected. Details that reinforce the developing picture become more persuasive, while conflicting details risk being viewed as exceptions rather than challenges to the broader story. This is the stage where Elizabeth Báthory begins to shift in the historical record, from a figure surrounded by rumor to one increasingly defined by it. The whispers were no longer isolated conversations exchanged between neighboring villages. They had become organized, documented, and increasingly capable of prompting official action. Once authorities began treating the rumors as something worthy of investigation rather than local gossip, the story crossed an important threshold. It no longer existed merely in conversation. It now existed within the historical record itself. And with that shift comes a changing consequence. Because rumors, while powerful, remain fluid. They can be dismissed, denied, or forgotten. But once they are formalized, once they are recorded investigated, and acknowledged by those in positions of authority, they begin to carry weight that is far more difficult to escape. By the end of this period, the transformation was already underway. The central question was no longer whether something unusual might be happening within Báthory's estates, but what the authorities intended to do about it, and perhaps even more importantly, who possessed the power to decide which version of events would become the official one. Because in a world where power often shaped the official version of events, the investigation was never going to be just about discovering what happened. It would also determine whose voices would be believed, whose testimony would survive, and whose version of the story history would inherit. The whispers had become accusations. The accusations were becoming evidence. And once that transformation was complete, there would be no easy way to separate the story from the record that preserved it. By the time the whispers surrounding Elizabeth Báthory had reached the level of formal inquiry, the story had already begun to harden. What had once been uncertain, shaped by distance and repetition, was now being gathered, written, and preserved. And with that preservation came a shift that would define everything that followed. Because once the story is recorded, it begins to resist change. Under the direction of Georgi Thurzo, the investigation into Báthory's estates intensified. This was no longer a matter of rumor drifting through villages or unease carried between households. It had become an official matter, one that required documentation, structure, and most importantly, testimony. The process relied heavily on collecting statements from those who had lived or worked within her domain: servants, former servants, local residents, individuals whose proximity to the alleged events positioned them as primary witnesses. In many ways, the investigation became an exercise in reconstruction. Officials were attempting to piece together years of alleged events from the memories of people whose experiences varied dramatically. Some claimed to have witnessed punishments directly. Others repeated stories that had circulated through the household for years. Every testimony added another piece to the picture, but not every piece carried the same weight. Over the course of the investigation, hundreds of testimonies were gathered. On the surface, that number creates the impression of something definitive, almost overwhelming in its scale, as though the sheer volume of voices alone could be enough to settle the matter. But numbers, like the stories they support, require context. Large collections of testimony can create the appearance of certainty, even when the circumstances surrounding those testimonies remain deeply complicated. Large numbers often create the illusion of certainty. We instinctively assume that hundreds of statements must point toward a single undeniable truth. But historians are generally more cautious than that. They ask how those statements were gathered, how independent they really were, and whether later witnesses may have been influenced by the stories already circulating around them. Not all testimonies carry the same weight. Many of the statements collected during this period were not first-hand accounts, but reports of what someone had heard from someone else. Details passed through multiple layers before ever being recorded. Others were gathered under conditions that raised legitimate questions about their reliability. Interrogation in the early 17th century was not designed to preserve accuracy in the modern sense. Pressure, both implicit and explicit, was considered a normal part of the investigative process, and in some cases torture was used to obtain confessions from those believed to have participated in the alleged crimes. When pain becomes part of the investigative process, truth becomes much harder to isolate. Several of Báthory's servants were arrested and questioned, accused of not only witnessing the alleged abuses, but of participating in them. Under interrogation, they confessed to a wide range of activities that closely matched the narrative already emerging around the investigation, including assisting in punishments, disposing of bodies, and helping facilitate the conditions under which the alleged crimes occurred. Those confessions would later become some of the strongest evidence presented against Elizabeth Báthory. Yet confessions obtained under duress occupy an uncomfortable place in historical analysis. They may contain genuine admissions, but they are also shaped by fear, exhaustion, pain, and the desire to satisfy the expectation of those conducting the interrogation. In those circumstances, a confession can become as much a reflection of the investigative process as of the events it claims to describe. Rather than making the case simpler, these statements leave historians with evidence that is simultaneously significant and deeply difficult to evaluate. Among the testimonies, certain themes begin to emerge with greater consistency. Accounts described young women subjected to extreme punishments, often for minor infractions or perceived disobedience. Beatings were said to escalate beyond correction, becoming prolonged and deliberate. Some witnesses spoke of exposure to freezing conditions, of victims left outside in winter or doused with water and forced to endure the cold. Others described confinement, starvation, and acts intended not just to discipline, but to degrade. These details, repeated across multiple testimonies, created a framework that was difficult to dismiss entirely. Because when independent accounts begin describing similar behavior, historians cannot simply dismiss them. Patterns do not automatically prove every detail is true, but neither can they be ignored. They demand an explanation, even if that explanation remains uncertain. And yet, even with these patterns, there are inconsistencies. The number of victims, for instance, fluctuates depending on the source. Some testimonies reference a handful of deaths, other dozens, and still others contribute to the much larger figure that would later define her legacy. The methods described also differ, with certain accounts including elements that appear only once or are elaborated upon in later retellings. Over time, these variations would be smoothed into a more cohesive narrative, but within the original records, they remain visible. It is within these inconsistencies that the central tension of the case becomes most visible. Rather than presenting a perfectly unified account, the surviving testimony suggests a narrative shaped by memory, interpretation, expectation, and perhaps even intention. That does not automatically invalidate the allegations, but it reminds us that the historical record is rarely created under ideal conditions. It is assembled from imperfect witnesses attempting to describe imperfectly remembered events. One of the most striking aspects of the testimonies is the absence of Elizabeth Báthory's own voice within them. She does not appear as a participant in the process of documentation. She is described, accused, defined, but she does not respond within the same record. Her perspective, whatever it may have been, is not preserved in a way that allows it to stand alongside the accounts gathered against her. This absence is not incidental. It is built into the very structure of the investigation itself. Elizabeth Báthory appears throughout the surviving record as someone being described, accused, and interpreted, yet she is almost never allowed to exist as an active participant in the creation of that record. Whatever defense she may have offered, whatever explanations she might have given, they survive only indirectly, if at all. The investigation became an accumulation of evidence directed toward a conclusion that may already have been taking shape, leaving testimony to function not simply as a search for truth, but as support for an increasingly established narrative. And once that narrative reached a certain threshold, it began to operate with a kind of inevitability. The image of Elizabeth Báthory as a figure of extreme cruelty was no longer confined to rumor or speculation. It had been documented, reinforced by multiple voices, and validated through the authority of those overseeing the investigation. Whether every detail was accurate became less relevant than the overall shape of the story that had emerged, because that shape was compelling. It was clear, defined, and aligned with existing fears about power, control, and what might occur when those elements existed without restraint. It transformed Báthory from a complex individual into something more singular, a representation of excess, of cruelty taken beyond the limits of what even her society might tolerate. And once a person becomes a symbol, the nuances of their reality often begin to fade. The testimonies, taken together, created a version of Elizabeth Báthory that could be understood, categorized, and ultimately condemned. They provide the foundation upon which all future interpretations would be built, influencing not only how she was perceived in her own time, but how she would be remembered long after. But foundations, no matter how solid they appear, are not immune to examination. Because beneath the weight of these testimonies lies a series of questions that remain unresolved. Questions about how they were collected, how they were interpreted, and how they were later presented to those who would never see the original context in which they were given. Questions about what was said, and what may have been left out. As the investigation progressed, these testimonies would move from documentation to action. They would no longer exist as records to be considered, but as evidence to be used. The transition from gathering information to enforcing consequence was already underway, and with it came a narrowing of possibilities. Because once action begins, the space for uncertainty begins to close. And in the case of Elizabeth Báthory, that closure would come not through a trial, not through a public examination of the evidence, but through a decision made within the structures of power that had both elevated and now turned against her. The investigation had begun as an attempt to determine what happened inside one noblewoman's estates. It ended by creating the framework through which every future generation would understand her. Whether those testimonies revealed its full truth, only part of it, or something shaped by politics and fear as much as memory, is a question historians continue to debate. But by the close of the investigation, one fact was already beyond dispute. Elizabeth Báthory's life had become a story. And stories once written into the historical record are remarkably difficult to rewrite. By the end of 1610, the story surrounding Elizabeth Báthory had reached a point where it could no longer remain contained within documents and testimonies. The investigation had gathered enough weight, through statements, confessions, and accumulating suspicion, that it demanded a conclusion. But what that conclusion would look like was never entirely clear, because the path forward did not follow the structure one might expect. There would be no formal trial. There would be no public examination of evidence, no moment where accusation and defense met in open confrontation before witnesses and the law. Instead, the decision would be carried out in a manner that reveals as much about the political realities of Elizabeth Báthory's world as it does about the allegations themselves. The investigation had reached the point where a judgment would come before public examination, and that choice would shape every historical question that followed. It begins with a journey. By the time Thurzo and his men approached the castle, rumors had been circulating for months, perhaps years. Whatever they expected to find, they almost certainly arrived carrying a story that had already taken shape in their minds. Every unanswered question, every testimony, every whispered accusation traveled with them through the gates. In many ways, the investigation had already written its own expectations before anyone crossed the threshold. In December of 1610, György Thurzo, acting in his capacity as Palatine of Hungary, traveled to one of Báthory's primary residences, Čachtice Castle. The purpose of his arrival was not ambiguous. He was there to intervene, to confront what had been described in the testimonies, and to bring an end to whatever was believed to be occurring within those walls. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but they all preserve the same basic structure. Thurzo entered the castle, and whatever he encountered inside quickly became the defining moment of the entire investigation. From that point forward, the story would be told as though every rumor had finally been confirmed, regardless of how consistently the surviving sources actually described the scene itself. According to later reports, the scene was immediate and unmistakable. The victims were said to have been discovered within the castle, some injured, others already dead. The implication was clear. The rumors had not only been true, but were actively unfolding at the moment of intervention. It is a detail that appears almost too precise, too aligned with the narrative that had been building. A moment of confirmation. A discovery that transformed suspicion into certainty. But like much of what surrounds Elizabeth Báthory, the clarity of this moment becomes less certain when examined closely, because the descriptions of what Thurzo found are not preserved in a single consistent account. They came from later records shaped by the same process of documentation and retelling that influenced the testimonies themselves. There is no unified report written at the time of entry that provides a definitive, unfiltered description of the scene. Instead, what exists are interpretations, accounts that align with the outcome that followed. This uncertainty matters because the entrance into Čachtice Castle has become the defining image of the entire case. If officials truly interrupted ongoing acts of brutality, it lends enormous weight to the accusations. If later writers embellished what was discovered to create a cleaner narrative, then one of the most famous scenes in the story rests on shakier historical ground than it first appears. Historians are left trying to reconstruct a moment that later generations may have simplified into something far more dramatic than the surviving evidence can fully support. Whatever the investigators believed they had found, the consequences followed immediately. Elizabeth Báthory was placed under arrest, though not in the sense most modern audiences would imagine. She was never taken into custody to await a public trial or formal examination of evidence. Instead, she was confined within her own residence, a decision that effectively treated the investigation as complete. The authorities had reached their conclusion. From that point forward, the remaining question was no longer what had happened inside the castle, but how that conclusion would be enforced and how it would be remembered. The absence of a trial is not a minor detail. It is one of the defining features of the entire case because it permanently limits what historians are able to know. A public proceeding would have required accusations to be tested, evidence to be examined openly, and some opportunity, however limited, for Elizabeth Báthory to answer the claims against her. None of that ever occurred, leaving later generations to reconstruct the case from records that document the accusations far more thoroughly than they document any possible defense. In a case defined by the scale and severity of the accusations, the lack of a formal legal process raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed. A trial would have required the presentation of evidence in a structured setting, the opportunity for defense, and the possibility, however unlikely, of challenging the accusations in a way that might have complicated the narrative. Instead, Elizabeth Báthory was removed from that possibility entirely. Confined to her castle, reportedly within a set of rooms that limit her movement and isolated her from the outside world. The details of this confinement vary, with some accounts suggesting that she was walled into her chambers, leaving only small openings for the passage of food and air. Others describe a less extreme form of house arrest, though still restrictive and permanent. What remains consistent is that she was never publicly tried, and that decision carries implications that extend beyond the immediate circumstances. Because a trial would not only have examined Elizabeth Báthory's actions, it would have exposed the broader context in which those actions were interpreted. It would have required those bringing the accusations forward to defend their claims under scrutiny, to establish credibility, and to navigate the complexities that often emerge when stories are examined closely. By avoiding that process, the narrative remained largely unchallenged. That immediately raises another historical question. Why was a public trial avoided in a case involving accusations of such extraordinary scale? One commonly proposed explanation is Elizabeth Báthory's position within the Hungarian nobility. A public prosecution of someone connected to one of the kingdom's most influential families carried political risks that extended well beyond the fate of a single individual. Confinement offered a practical solution, allowing the authorities to remove her from power while avoiding the instability that highly public legal confrontation might have created. But there is another possibility. That the absence of a trial was not simply about preserving stability, but about preserving the narrative itself. Because once a story is subjected to scrutiny, it can change. Details that seemed certain may become uncertain. Testimonies may reveal inconsistencies, motivations may come into question. And in a case where the outcome had already begun to take shape, introducing that level of uncertainty may not have been desirable, especially if political considerations carried as much weight as judicial ones, something that was hardly unusual in 17th century Europe. Elizabeth Báthory's wealth, her estates, and her position within the nobility were not insignificant factors. Control of land and resources in this period was closely tied to political influence, and the removal of a figure like Báthory would inevitably alter the distribution of that influence. While her children retained portions of the estate, the broader impact of her confinement would have reshaped the balance around her holdings. Whether this was a primary motivation or a secondary consequence is difficult to determine, but it exists within the context of the decision that was made. Following her arrest, the focus shifted to those around her. Several of her servants were tried and executed, their confessions serving as both evidence and reinforcement of the narrative that had been constructed. Unlike Báthory, they did face formal proceedings, though the conditions under which their confessions were obtained complicate the reliability of those outcomes. Their executions provided more than just a sense of closure. They demonstrated that the authorities had acted decisively, but they also reinforced the broader narrative surrounding Elizabeth Báthory herself. Punishing those alleged to have assisted in the crimes gave the investigation an appearance of finality, strengthening the impression that the accusations had moved beyond suspicion into established historical fact. Whether every detail deserved that level of certainty is a separate question, but from that point forward the story carried the weight of official consequence. Because by punishing those who were said to have assisted in the alleged crimes, the narrative gained a sense of validation. It was no longer just a collection of testimonies. It was a sequence of events that had led to consequences, reinforcing the idea that what had been described was not only possible, but proven. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Báthory remained within her confinement, alive but removed, present but unable to influence the story that was continuing to form around her. She would remain there for the rest of her life, dying in 1614, 4 years after her arrest. There would be no final statement, no recorded defense, no moment where her perspective enters the historical record in a way that can be weighed against the accusations. What remains, instead, is silence. And silence, in a story like this, does not remain empty. It is filled by those who continue to tell it. By the time of her death, Elizabeth Báthory had already begun to transform. No longer just a noblewoman accused of crimes, she was becoming something else. Something defined not only by what was said to have happened, but by how those events were interpreted, expanded, and remembered. The night Thurzo entered Čachtice Castle became the dividing line between Elizabeth Báthory, the noblewoman, and Elizabeth Báthory, the legend. Everything before that night exists in fragments: letters, rumors, testimonies, and competing interpretations. Everything afterward is filtered through the decision that had already been made. She would never again speak publicly in her own defense. She would never stand before a court. She would never challenge the story taking shape around her. History would do that instead. And history rarely limits itself to the facts alone. After Elizabeth Báthory's death in 1614, the immediate urgency surrounding her case began to fade, but the story itself did not. In many ways, it was only beginning to take its final form. What had once existed as a testimony, rumor, and political action now entered a different phase, one shaped by those who witnessed events directly, but by those who recorded, interpreted, and retold them. It is in this transition that Elizabeth Báthory ceased to be only a historical figure and became something far more enduring: a narrative. At first, that narrative remained relatively contained. Early references to her case appeared in legal documents, correspondences, and regional accounts that reflected the perspective of those closest to the events. These sources preserved the accusations and the outcome, but they did not yet fully transform her into the figure that would later dominate historical imagination. That transformation required distance, both in time and in interpretation. It required the story to be revisited by individuals who were not bound by the immediate context of the early 17th century, and who could reshape it according to the concerns and fascinations of their own era. By the 18th century, that process was well underway. Scholars and chroniclers began to revisit Báthory's case, drawing from existing records but also expanding upon them. Details that had once been ambiguous became more defined. Numbers grew more precise, even when the original sources did not support such certainty. The claim that she had murdered hundreds of young women, for instance, became more firmly established during this period, despite the lack of consistent evidence in the earliest testimonies. It is here that the story begins to shift from documentation to legend, as the desire for clarity and impact begins to outweigh the complexities of the original record. This is also the point at which one of the most enduring elements of her legend begins to take shape: the association with blood as a means of preserving youth. The image of Elizabeth Báthory bathing in the blood of her victims is now inseparable from her identity, yet it does not appear in the earliest accounts of her alleged crimes. Instead, it emerges later, introduced through retellings that sought to emphasize the symbolic nature of her supposed cruelty. Blood, in this context, becomes more than a detail. It becomes a motif, transforming her from a figure accused of violence into something closer to myth. This evolution is not accidental. It reflects the way stories adapt to the expectations of those who tell them. By the time Báthory's legend began to circulate more widely, Europe was already developing a cultural fascination with figures that blurred the line between human and monstrous. The themes present in her story, youth, decay, power, and the consumption of life, aligned closely with the emerging ideas that would later define vampire folklore. Although Elizabeth Báthory lived before the widespread popularization of vampire legends, her story would eventually be retroactively connected to them, reinforcing her place within a broader tradition of horror and myth. The connection worked in both directions. As vampire literature grew in popularity during the 18th and 19th centuries, audiences became increasingly interested in historical figures who seemed to embody those same themes. Elizabeth Báthory was an almost irresistible candidate. Whether or not her story had anything to do with vampiric folklore originally became less important than how naturally it fit the cultural imagination that followed. In many ways, vampire mythology helped preserve her legend just as her legend enriched vampire mythology. As a result, the historical Elizabeth Báthory became increasingly difficult to separate from the symbolic version that replaced her. The details of her life were no longer examined solely for their factual accuracy, but for how well they fit within the narrative that had been constructed. Each retelling added something new, smoothing inconsistencies, emphasizing certain elements while diminishing others, until the story reached a point where it felt complete. Not necessarily true, but complete in a way that satisfied the expectations of those hearing it. And that sense of completion is powerful. There was also something deeply human at work here. We are naturally drawn towards stories with clear villains because they offer the comforting illusion that evil can be recognized, understood, and confined to a single individual. Ambiguity is far more difficult to live with. A monster whose motives remain uncertain is unsettling. A monster whose guilt itself remains uncertain is even more so, because it creates the illusion that the story has been resolved. All that necessary details have been accounted for. It discourages further questioning, not through evidence, but through narrative cohesion. When a story feels whole, there is less incentive to examine its foundations. But those foundations remain, and when they are revisited, they reveal a more complicated picture than the legend suggests. Modern historians who have examined the case of Elizabeth Báthory have often approached it with a different set of priorities, focusing less on the narrative that developed over time and more on the conditions under which the narrative was created. This involves a closer examination of the testimonies, the political environment, and the individuals involved in the investigation. It also requires acknowledging the limitations of the available sources, many of which were recorded under circumstances that make them difficult to interpret with certainty. Rather than asking whether Elizabeth Báthory was simply guilty or innocent, many historians approach the surviving evidence differently. They examine how records were created, who benefited from particular narratives, and what later generations may have added to the story. Their goal is often less about reaching certainty than understanding how certainty itself was constructed. Within this reevaluation, several alternative perspectives have emerged. One suggests that while Elizabeth Báthory may have been harsh and even abusive noblewoman, the scale of her alleged crimes were exaggerated over time. In this view, The testimonies reflect a reality that has been amplified through retelling, transforming acts of cruelty into something far more extreme than what may have actually occurred. This interpretation does not absolve her, but it challenges the extent to which she has been portrayed as uniquely monstrous. Another perspective goes further, proposing that the entire case may have been influenced by political motivations. As a wealthy widow with significant landholdings, Báthory occupied a position that could have made her a target for those seeking to redistribute power. The involvement of high-ranking officials in the investigation, combined with the decision to confine her without trial, has led some historians to question whether the accusations were, in at least part, constructed to justify her removal. In this interpretation, the narrative of the Blood Countess becomes not just a story of alleged violence, but an example of how reputations can be shaped and potentially weaponized within systems of power. It is important to recognize that these perspectives are not universally accepted. The evidence available does not allow for a definitive conclusion in either direction. There are elements of the case that suggest genuine wrongdoing, just as there are elements that invite skepticism. The testimonies, while inconsistent, do contain recurring themes. The actions taken against her, while lacking a formal trial, were supported by individuals with significant authority. The absence of her own account leaves a gap that cannot be filled with certainty. And it is within that gap that the story continues to exist. Because Elizabeth Báthory's legacy is not defined by a single, uncontested truth. It is defined by the tension between competing interpretations, each shaped by the limitations of the sources and the perspectives of those examining them. She exists simultaneously as a historical figure, a subject of investigation, and a symbol constructed through centuries of retelling. This tension is what allows her story to endure. It resists resolution, not because the truth is entirely inaccessible, but because it has been layered beneath so many interpretations that separating one from another becomes increasingly difficult. Each attempt to clarify her story adds another layer, another perspective, another possibility that complicates the narrative rather than simplifying it. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of all, because it aligns with the broader question at the center of this season. The idea that history does not simply record events, but shapes them. The story of Elizabeth Báthory illustrates how easily a life can be transformed into a legend, how details can be expanded, reinterpreted, and ultimately solidified into something that feels definitive, even when it is built on uncertain ground. Elizabeth Báthory may have been exactly the monster history remembers. She may have been responsible for acts of cruelty so extraordinary that later generations struggled to believe they had really happened. Or her story may represent what occurs when rumor, politics, memory, and mythology slowly settle around a real life until the original person becomes almost impossible to recover. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we cannot completely separate those possibilities. History rarely preserves the past in perfect condition. More often, it preserves layers of interpretation laid down by everyone who chose to tell the story afterward. And that may be Elizabeth Báthory's greatest legacy. Not simply that she became one of history's most infamous monsters, but that her story reveals how monsters themselves are sometimes built. One testimony, one retelling, and one generation at a time. There is a moment, in stories like this, where the past stops feeling like something that happened and begins to feel like something that was chosen. Not chosen in the sense of invention, but in the sense of selection, of emphasis, of repetition, of deciding which details are carried forward and which are allowed to disappear. By the time Elizabeth Báthory's name settled into history as the Blood Countess, that process had already been completed. What remained was not simply a record, but a version strong enough to survive centuries, cross languages and cultures, and adapt itself to the expectations of each era without losing its essential shape. That kind of endurance is not accidental. It suggests that the story fulfills something beyond the particulars of one woman's life, answering a fear or satisfying a need powerful enough to keep it alive. In doing so, the legend becomes difficult to challenge, not because it is unquestionably true, but because it has come to feel necessary. The image of Elizabeth Báthory that persists is precise in its construction. She exists at the intersection of power and cruelty, privilege and excess. She is remembered not merely as someone who operated within the brutal norms of her world, but as someone who exceeded them so completely that ordinary explanations no longer seem sufficient. The scale of her alleged crimes place her beyond easy comprehension, allowing her to function as more than a historical person. She becomes a warning about authority without accountability, hierarchy without restraint, and what can happen when power and vulnerability occupy the same space. Those fears are not confined to 17th century Hungary, which is one reason her story has never remained there. But symbols are rarely neutral. They are shaped by the perspectives of those who create and maintain them. And when a person becomes a symbol, the details of the reality often adjust to fit meaning they are meant to convey. In the case of Elizabeth Báthory, this process has resulted in a narrative that feels complete, even as the foundations beneath it remain uncertain. Certainty remains elusive because the surviving record preserves the accusations without preserving a reliable way to resolve them. The testimonies offer detail, but their collection complicates their credibility. Her confinement supplies an outcome, but the absence of a public trial denies us the confrontation between accusation and defense that might have clarified the case. Later retellings provide coherence, but that coherence was often achieved by smoothing away the very contradictions historians now struggle to interpret. We are left with enough evidence to prevent easy dismissal, but not enough clarity to justify complete confidence. That unresolved tension is not weakness in the story. It is the reason the story remains alive. A mystery with no evidence eventually collapses, but while a case with definitive resolution eventually settles. Elizabeth Báthory's story occupies the more enduring space between them, containing enough substance to demand attention and enough uncertainty to resist closure. Because it leaves space for interpretation, for speculation, for the kind of uncertainty that invites continued engagement. A story that is fully resolved often fades, its purpose fulfilled. But a story that remains open, one that allows for multiple possibilities, continues to live, reshaped each time it is told. Elizabeth Báthory's legacy exists within that space. She can still be interpreted as a prolific killer, a politically convenient target, or a guilty woman whose crimes were expanded far beyond the surviving evidence. None of those possibilities can be confirmed completely, and none can be dismissed without confronting evidence that complicates the conclusion. Which brings us back to the question at the center of this season. Were these people truly monsters, or did history make monsters of them? In the case of Elizabeth Báthory, the answer does not present itself in a way that can be neatly concluded. There are elements of her story that suggest genuine cruelty, just as there are elements that suggest exaggeration, distortion, or even intentional construction. The evidence does not resolve these contradictions, it preserves them. In preserving those contradictions, the case reveals something that extends beyond Elizabeth Báthory. History is merely a record of what happened. It is also a record of how events were understood, interpreted, selected, and remembered. The Blood Countess, as she exists today, is a result of that process, an accumulation of testimony, investigation, retelling, and belief shaped as much by those who spoke about her as by whatever actions she may have committed. That is the power of narrative. It can define a person long after death, reducing a complicated life to a handful of characteristics strong enough to feel permanent, even when their foundations remain uncertain. Once such a version takes hold, undoing it becomes extraordinarily difficult because history, like any storyteller, tends to favor coherence over ambiguity. It prefers people who can be understood clearly, remembered easily, and passed from one generation to the next without requiring constant re-examination. Elizabeth Báthory became exactly that kind of figure. But completeness does not always equal certainty. Her story may contain the remains of extraordinary cruelty. It may also contain exaggeration, political advantage, inherited assumptions, and the details added long after her death. More than one of those things may be true at once. The point is not to replace one convenient answer with another, but to recognize how easily answers become permanent when they have been repeated long enough. Elizabeth Báthory may have been a monster. History may have made a monster of her. Between those possibilities stands the woman herself, almost entirely obscured by the story built in her name. We may never know exactly who she was, but after following the path by which she became the Blood Countess, we are left with a question that reaches far beyond her castle, her century, or her legend. Not simply, who was she? But who taught history to remember her that way?